Amsterdam. The year is 1650. In the winter of that year, a Dutch merchant's body was found floating face down in the Prinsengracht Canal. He had been dead for 3 days before anyone reported it. Not because no one saw him. They saw him on the very first morning. They simply chose not to. Because the man had been last seen walking down Zwarte Steeg. And no one who understood Amsterdam ever asked questions about Zwarte Steeg. Amsterdam in 1650 is the wealthiest place on the face of the earth. More gold flows through its canals than through any port in London, Lisbon, or Madrid. The Dutch East India Company, the single most powerful trading enterprise ever assembled by human hands, controls half of all maritime trade between Europe and Asia from its offices just 2 streets from the harbor. Spices, silk, diamonds, slaves, weapons, secrets. Everything that can be bought and sold passes through Amsterdam, and most of it passes through here at a profit no other nation on earth can match. The city glitters. There are over 160,000 souls packed into a web of concentric canals and narrow bridges. Their tall, narrow merchant houses leaning slightly forward over the water as if straining to count the coins being unloaded below. On the main canal streets, merchant lords build palaces 6 stories high, hang paintings worth a craftsman's lifetime wages in their entrance halls, and dress their wives in silk imported from the very edges of the known world. It is, by every visible measure, a city of order, commerce, and Protestant virtue. But there is a street in Amsterdam's oldest quarter, barely 4 meters wide between its rotting timber walls, that tells a different story entirely. A street that the city's magistrates know exists and refuse to discuss. A street where the guild of honest merchants will not walk after dark. A street where, in the space of roughly 140 meters of cobblestone, you could find a contract killer, a forger of royal seals, a woman who had poisoned 2 husbands, a fence for stolen cargo from 3 continents, and a man who claimed, and this was widely believed, to have once bribed an admiral of the Dutch fleet. Its name was Zwarte Steeg, the Black Alley. And this is what happened there. To understand Zwarte Steeg, you must first understand what Amsterdam had become by the middle of the 17th century. The city's rise had been so violent, so rapid, and so total that it had outgrown every institution designed to govern it. The city magistrates, the burgomasters and their council of aldermen, were, most of them, honest enough men of commerce. But Amsterdam was not merely a city anymore. It was the nerve center of a global trading empire that spanned 4 continents. And the machinery that kept that empire running could not always afford to be honest. Contracts needed to disappear. Witnesses needed to be persuaded into silence. Cargo that appeared on no official manifest needed to reach its destination without inconvenient inspection. Letters needed to be carried between parties who could not be seen speaking to each other in public. Money needed to move between men whose names appeared on opposite sides of legal proceedings. And all of this, every dark, necessary, profitable piece of it, required people who operated outside the law and entirely within the logic of power. Those people lived on Zwarte Steeg. The street itself was unremarkable to the eye of a stranger. It ran between 2 slightly larger streets in the oldest part of the city, close enough to the harbor that you could smell the salt and tar on cold mornings. The buildings were old, older than the Great Canal expansion, older than the Dutch Golden Age, older than the Republic itself. Their facades were dark with accumulated smoke and rain, their gabled rooftops irregular, their windows small and shuttered even in daylight. A stranger walking through would see a few small shops, a candlemaker, a cobbler, a woman selling smoked herring from a wooden cart. nothing that would draw a second glance. But the stranger would notice one thing, if he was paying attention. He would notice that no one on Zwarte Steeg looked at him. Not because they were indifferent, every single person on that street was acutely aware of every stranger who entered it. But because making eye contact with a stranger on Zwarte Steeg was a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was a liability. The people of Zwarte Steeg had survived and prospered by being, in every official sense, invisible. And they extended that invisibility to everyone else who passed through their world, as both courtesy and warning. Amsterdam in 1650 had no professional police force in any modern sense. The city's watch, a rotating body of local men paid a pittance and armed with halberds, patrolled the main streets and canals. The narrow back streets of the oldest quarters were, in practice, ungoverned. The city authorities knew this. They also knew that the commerce flowing through Amsterdam's shadow economy, stolen cargo, forged documents, illegal loans, intelligence brokerage, was worth millions of guilders annually. Disrupting it entirely would have disrupted the legitimate economy alongside it, so they maintained a studied ignorance. The watch did not patrol Zwarte Steeg. No official record acknowledged its inhabitants. It was the city's open secret, and its darkest one simultaneously. The street had not always been this way. 2 generations earlier, it had been a street of leather workers, and before that, according to older residents who claimed to remember, a street of dyers whose vats of indigo and madder had stained the cobblestones blue and red for 100 years. The color had long since washed away, but the name, Black Alley, was said by some to come from those dye-stained years, and by others to come from the nature of the business conducted there now. Both explanations were probably true. The transformation of Zwarte Steeg into what it was by 1650 had been gradual, and, in its own way, entirely logical. When the Dutch East India Company began its explosive expansion in the early decades of the century, Amsterdam's harbor filled almost overnight with ships from every nation, carrying cargo of every description, crewed by men who spoke 40 different languages and owed allegiance to nobody in particular. The city that grew up to service them needed people who could operate in the spaces between legal jurisdictions, brokers who could negotiate a deal without a contract, translators who knew when to mistranslate, fixers who could make a problem disappear before it became a scandal. Those people gathered, as such people always do, in a particular place, and the place they gathered in Amsterdam was Zwarte Steeg. By 1650, the street had developed its own internal order, its own hierarchy, its own customs and laws, none of which were written down anywhere, and all of which were enforced with a precision that the official legal system of Amsterdam could only envy. There was a man known simply as the notary, who had never in his life practiced law in any official capacity, but who had arbitrated more disputes and sealed more agreements than any 3 legitimate notaries in the city. There was a woman called Mevrouw Droog, Mistress Dry, a nickname whose origins nobody quite remembered, who ran the largest money-lending operation in Amsterdam's underworld from a set of unremarkable rooms above a candle shop, and whose ledgers, had they ever been produced in court, would have implicated half the city council. There was a Flemish man called the Painter, who produced forgeries of such extraordinary quality that several of his fabricated East India Company manifests were still, in 1650, circulating as genuine documents in the company's own archives. And then there was the man at the very top of Zwarte Steeg's invisible hierarchy, the man whose name almost nobody on the street spoke aloud, who was referred to in conversation simply as the factor, as in the decisive factor, the element without which nothing worked. His actual name, if anyone still knew it, was never used. He had lived on Zwarte Steeg for 23 years. He was, by the rough estimates of those who had occasion to know, somewhere between 50 and 60 years of age. He was of medium height, medium build, with a face so deliberately forgettable that witnesses questioned about him afterward invariably described a different man. He dressed in the clothes of a prosperous but unremarkable merchant. He attended church on Sundays at a congregation 3 streets away, where he was known as a quiet, generous donor and a man of modest and godly habits. He was, in the estimation of every senior intelligence officer in 3 European nations who had tried to identify him, the most capable operator in Northern Europe's underworld. And he had never, in 23 years, been arrested, indicted, named in a legal proceeding, or even officially acknowledged to exist. There were men on that street who had spoken to kings, not to their ambassadors, not to their ministers, but to the kings themselves, and had been paid in gold to keep silent about what was said. There were women who knew the private financial arrangements of 3 of Amsterdam's most powerful merchant families, and had never spoken a word of it to anyone outside the street. There were specialists whose skills were so particular and so rare that clients came from as far as Hamburg and Antwerp and London specifically to engage them, traveling to Amsterdam on the pretext of legitimate commerce, making their way to Zwarte Steeg by routes sufficiently indirect to defeat casual observation, and departing with whatever they had come for, sealed inside a document wallet or a memory, leaving no trace of the transaction in any record that any official authority would ever see. This was the world of Zwarte Steeg, and in the autumn of 1650, something happened that came closer to destroying it than anything in its 20-year history as Amsterdam's invisible center of power. The most common misconception about places like Zwarte Steeg was that they operated in chaos, that they were lawless in the literal sense, without law, without order, without structure. This misconception was, in a sense, the street's greatest protection. Officials and reformers who thought of criminal communities as anarchic were consistently surprised when their attempts to disrupt them produced no lasting effect, because they failed to understand that the thing they were trying to disrupt was not chaos, but a very carefully maintained alternative order. Zwarte Steeg had rules. They were not written anywhere. They were never explicitly stated to newcomers. They were absorbed through observation, through small corrections, through the occasional and unmistakable object lesson. But they were as real and as consistently enforced as any statute in the Dutch Republic's legal code, and in some respects considerably more so, because violating them carried consequences that were immediate, proportionate, and guaranteed. The first and most fundamental rule was silence. No one who lived or worked on Zwarte Steeg discussed the street's activities with anyone outside it. This seems obvious. Of course, criminals do not publicize their crimes. But on Zwarte Steeg, the rule went considerably further than simple caution. The candlemaker's shop at the entrance to the street was a real candlemaker's shop, producing real candles that were sold to real customers for real money. The cobbler repaired real shoes. The herring woman sold real herring. These were not cover stories in any crude sense. They were fully functioning, legitimate businesses that provided their operators with a credible account of their existence and income, and that brought ordinary customers onto the street who provided, by their ordinariness, a kind of camouflage for everything else. The second rule was more subtle. No operator on Zwarte Steeg worked for a client whose interests directly conflicted with those of another operator's client without first disclosing the conflict and obtaining clearance from the factor. This rule had its origins in a near-catastrophic incident in 1638, when 2 separate operators had simultaneously taken commissions from parties on opposite sides of a commercial dispute, with the result that one of the parties had been tipped off to the other's plans by a cascade of inadvertent information sharing that had come within a single afternoon of exposing both operators and the entire network. The factor had personally arbitrated the aftermath, extracted both operators from their respective commitments at considerable cost, and instituted the conflict of interest protocol that governed the street from that day forward. No one had challenged it since, not because it was always convenient, it frequently was not, but because everyone on the street understood that their individual prosperity depended entirely on the collective reputation for discretion and reliability that the protocol protected. The third rule governed territory. Zwarte Steeg operated, in the broader landscape of Amsterdam's underworld, as a service provider rather than a territorial power. The street did not control neighborhoods, did not tax other criminal enterprises, did not seek to expand its geographical footprint. Its operators worked for clients who came to them. They did not go looking for business, did not recruit, did not solicit. This restraint was partly philosophical. The factor had always maintained that expansion was the enemy of discretion, and partly strategic, since it meant that Zwarte Steeg had no territorial conflicts with any of the other criminal organizations operating in Amsterdam, and was therefore in the unusual position of being genuinely neutral in the city's underworld politics. The fourth rule was the most personal and the most absolute. No operator on Zwarte Steeg ever harmed, physically, financially, or professionally, any other operator on the street. When a newcomer to the street in 1644 attempted to steal a client from one of the established information brokers by approaching the client directly and offering to undercut the broker's price, the newcomer woke the following morning to find that every contact, every client, every source, and every relationship he had established in Amsterdam had been quietly and comprehensively informed that he was unreliable. Not by any single person. The message had been delivered through 30 different channels simultaneously in the space of a single night. The newcomer was bankrupt within a week. He understood, when he thought about it afterward, that it could have been far worse. It had been intended as a lesson, not a punishment. The street did not need laws because it had something more powerful than laws. Consequences that were certain, immediate, and perfectly proportionate to the offense. No judge in Amsterdam could say the same. Understanding Zwarte Steeg means understanding the specific people who inhabited it. The first and most fundamental category of resident was the information broker. Amsterdam in 1650 was, among other things, the information capital of Europe. More printed matter was produced in Amsterdam than in any other city on the continent. But the most valuable information never appeared in print. It moved by word of mouth, through networks of carefully maintained relationships. And on Zwarte Steeg, there were 3 men and 1 woman whose entire livelihood consisted of knowing things that other people would pay to know. The woman was called Anneke van der Berg, though whether this was her true name was uncertain, even to the people who had known her for years. She was perhaps 40 years of age, with the kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable. And she had the extraordinary gift of being able to sit in a tavern or a market stall for 4 hours and give every impression of being interested in nothing more than her ale and her knitting, while in fact absorbing every conversation within earshot with perfect retention. She had learned this skill, she once told the factor, from her mother, who had been a servant in a wealthy merchant's household for 30 years and had survived through the careful cultivation of apparent ignorance. Anneke had refined her mother's survival skill into a profession, She sold what she heard to people who needed to know it, and she had survived on Zwarte Steeg for 11 years without ever once being caught passing information, because she never wrote anything down, never met a client in the same place twice, and had the professional discipline never to sell the same piece of information to parties whose interests were in direct conflict. The information brokers fed a second and related profession, the fixers. Their work varied enormously in its specifics, but was unified by a single underlying logic. The fixer existed to solve problems that could not be solved through official channels, using resources that official channels could not access, and to do so without leaving any trace that could connect the solution to the client who had paid for it. A merchant whose cargo had been confiscated by a corrupt customs official might need that cargo to reappear at a different dock with different documentation. A man whose name appeared on a debt register might need that name removed before his creditors could act on it. A widow whose late husband had left evidence of dealings that could result in the posthumous seizure of her estate needed that evidence to no longer exist. None of this was legal. All of it was necessary. The fixer charged accordingly. The most capable fixer on Zwarte Steeg was a man of Flemish origin called Peter. He was perhaps 35 years of age, of slight build and quiet manner, with the useful quality of being able to move through any social environment without drawing attention. He spoke Dutch, French, German, and enough English and Portuguese to negotiate. His particular specialty was documentation. He understood better than anyone on Zwarte Steeg that in a commercial republic as thoroughly bureaucratized as the Dutch Republic, the document was the fundamental unit of reality. A cargo existed if it had a manifest. A debt existed if it appeared in a register. A man's identity was what his papers said it was. And a document that said the right thing, regardless of whether the right thing was true, was, for almost all practical purposes, indistinguishable from truth. Peter had spent 8 years cultivating relationships with minor clerks, archive keepers, notaries' assistants, and harbor officials throughout Amsterdam. And through those relationships, he could, for the right price, make a document exist that had not existed before, or make a document disappear that had. He charged between 50 and 500 guilders per commission, depending on the complexity and risk involved. And he had never, in 8 years, produced a piece of work that had been conclusively identified as fraudulent by any official proceeding. In Amsterdam, paper was power. And no one on Zwarte Steeg understood this more completely than the men and women who made their living by making paper say whatever needed to be said. Beyond the information brokers and the fixers, Zwarte Steeg housed a third category of resident, whose work was more straightforward and considerably more dangerous: the enforcers. Not assassins, though the street had produced at least 2 men who had worked as such in their younger years, but specialists in the application of physical and psychological pressure to people who had defaulted on agreements, or who had made the mistake of crossing the wrong party. There were 3 such men on Zwarte Steeg in 1650, and they worked as a unit. They were known collectively as the Three. The most effective of them had a reputation for never having raised a hand to anyone in his professional life. His talent lay in an almost preternatural ability to convey, through posture, eye contact, and the careful selection of words, that the person he was speaking to was standing at the edge of a very steep drop, and that whether they stepped back from it or went over it was a choice they were entirely free to make, but that only one of those choices led to continued prosperity. And then there were the specialists whose roles were harder to categorize. A woman who had been a midwife in her legitimate years, but who now produced, on demand, substances that could cause illness, unconsciousness, or, at considerably greater cost and with strict criteria she applied entirely at her own discretion, death. A man who had worked for 10 years as a harbor pilot and retained an encyclopedic knowledge of every dock, warehouse, inlet, and back channel in Amsterdam, and within 20 kilometers of it, making him indispensable to anyone needing to move cargo without official observation. A former soldier from the wars in the South, who now hired himself out as personal protection to men who had reason to fear for their safety, and who had acquired, over 12 years of this work, a reputation for absolute reliability that commanded a premium no client ever questioned. These were the people of Zwarte Steeg. They were not, as a general rule, violent. They were not glamorous. They were not the stuff of tavern legend. They were professionals in the strictest sense. People who had identified a market need, developed the skills to serve that need, and built a reputation sufficient to command premium prices for their services. They happened to operate entirely outside the law, but within their own community, they were governed by a code of conduct more rigorously observed than most formal legal systems. Because in a community where trust was the only currency that actually mattered, betrayal was the only crime that carried a mandatory and immediate penalty. The operators of Zwarte Steeg charged prices that, by the standards of legitimate Amsterdam commerce, were extraordinary. A simple document adjustment commanded 50 guilders, roughly the monthly wage of a skilled craftsman. A full identity construction, producing a new name, a new history, new documentation, and a plausible legend capable of withstanding official scrutiny, cost between 300 and 500 guilders. The reason clients paid these prices was not that they had no alternatives. They paid because Zwarte Steeg's operators had established over decades a reputation for absolute reliability that no alternative could match. A client who brought a commission to Zwarte Steeg could be certain of three things: the work would be done, the work would be done correctly, and no word of it would ever leave the street. This certainty was worth every guilder of the premium. In October of 1650, a letter arrived in Amsterdam from Madrid. It was addressed to a name that did not correspond to any known resident of the city, sealed with a wax stamp that bore no recognized emblem, and delivered by a courier who, when questioned about his employer, gave an answer that satisfied the receiving party and nobody else. The letter changed everything on Zwarte Steeg, not because of what it said, though what it said was extraordinary, but because of who had been paid to intercept it before it arrived, and who had failed to do so. The commission had come in through Annika, as most intelligence work did. A client she had worked with twice before, a man she knew only as the merchant, whose actual identity she had deliberately never sought to learn, had come to her in late September with a commission of unusual scope. He needed to know the contents of a letter that would arrive in Amsterdam sometime in the first 2 weeks of October, before it reached its intended recipient. He could not tell her who the intended recipient was, because he did not know. The letter was being sent to an alias. He could not tell her from whom the letter came, beyond the fact that it originated in Spain. He could pay 200 guilders for the contents of the letter, or 300 if the original letter itself could be obtained rather than merely copied. Annika had taken the commission to the factor, as any commission of that complexity required. The factor had listened to her account of the meeting without interrupting. He had asked her 4 questions. How long had she known the merchant? What had the previous 2 commissions involved? How had he communicated his request? And what had his manner been during the meeting? Her answers established, to the factor's satisfaction, that the merchant was a genuine client with a specific and focused need, rather than a test or a provocation. He had assigned the commission to Peter, with Annika's continued involvement as the client liaison, and to one of the harbor contacts, a man called Boss, who had worked the postal docks for 6 years and knew which ships carried which letters and through whose hands they passed before reaching their destinations. The three of them had spent a week mapping the possible routes by which a letter from Madrid could arrive in Amsterdam in October. By sea from a Spanish or Portuguese port, over land through France and the southern Netherlands, or through the network of private couriers used by merchants and diplomats who preferred not to use official postal routes. They had identified the 6 most probable arrival points and assigned a watcher to each. In the Dutch Republic of the mid-17th century, there was no single postal service. Letters moved through a complex web of private carriers, guild messengers, ship captains who carried correspondence as a sideline, and the nascent official postal route networks that were just beginning to be established across Europe. A letter from Madrid to Amsterdam might pass through 7 or 8 different pairs of hands before arriving. At each transition, there was, in principle, an opportunity to read or copy its contents, but only if you knew which hands would hold it and when. This was exactly the kind of knowledge that Bos, with his 6 years on the postal docks and his network of contacts across Amsterdam's waterfront, possessed. The problem, as it emerged in the second week of October, was that someone else was also looking for the letter. Not the same client, this became clear quickly, but a separate party with the same objective. The first sign was a watcher at the southern packet boat dock, who reported, on the 9th of October, that a man he did not recognize had been asking questions about incoming Spanish correspondence. By the time the factor heard the report that evening, a second watcher at the mail carrier's warehouse near the dam rack had reported the same stranger asking similar questions. The factor was not alarmed, exactly. Competition for intelligence was a normal feature of the market he operated in. What concerned him was the timing. Whoever was looking for this letter had started looking at almost the same moment his own watchers had been deployed, which meant either that the commission had leaked, an almost inconceivable breach on Zwarte Steeg, or that the letter itself had become important through a development neither the merchant nor the factor had anticipated. He called Annika and Peter to the back room and put the problem to them directly. Annika's assessment was that the commission had not leaked on their end. Peter agreed, which meant the second party had learned of the letter's existence through an entirely independent channel, which meant the letter was important enough that at least 2 separate parties in Amsterdam had been independently motivated to obtain it, without either of them knowing about the other. This made the letter considerably more interesting, and the commission considerably more dangerous. The factor made a decision that night that was characteristic of the way he worked. He did not increase the pressure on the watchers or attempt to accelerate the interception. Instead, he sent a message, through a channel careful enough to be untraceable, to the operator of the second search, proposing a meeting. Neutral ground, daylight hours, both parties alone. The message offered no explanation and no demands. It simply communicated that he knew the second party was searching, that the second party should know he was also searching, and that a conversation before either party found the letter was preferable to the alternative. The response came back within 18 hours. Yes. The most dangerous moments on Zwarte Steeg were never the ones involving knives or threats. They were the ones where 2 sets of professionals, each perfectly capable of genuine harm, sat down across a table from each other and tried to find an arrangement that made the harm unnecessary. The meeting happened in a small tavern near the old church on the morning of the 11th of October. The factor arrived alone and sat at a corner table where he could see both the entrance and the rear door. He ordered ale. He waited. The person who came through the door 12 minutes later was not a man. She was a woman of perhaps 45 years, dressed in the sober, dark wool of a merchant's widow, with a face that was intelligent and contained, and completely without any readable expression. She sat across from him without greeting him, ordered nothing, and looked at him with an expectation that told him she was accustomed to conducting business in exactly this way. He told her what he knew, that they were both looking for the same letter, that he had been engaged to obtain it by a specific client, that he had no interest in whatever use she intended to make of it beyond ensuring that his client's commission was fulfilled. He offered two possible arrangements. In the first, she stepped back from her search and allowed his people to find the letter, in exchange for a full copy of its contents delivered to her within 24 hours of its interception. In the second, they pooled their resources, found it faster, and agreed in advance on how the original and copies would be distributed. She listened to both options without interruption. Then she said, in Dutch, spoken with an accent he could not quite place, Flemish, perhaps, or Northern French, that she preferred a third option. That she would continue her search independently, that she assumed he would do the same, and that whichever of them found the letter first would, as a professional courtesy, send the other a sealed copy within 48 hours. She would not explain her commission. She trusted he would not explain his. She assumed they were both capable of maintaining the necessary discretion. She stood, offered him the brief nod that passed for a formal farewell in their world, and left. The factor sat with his ale for a long time after she left. He had expected negotiation. He had gotten a statement of parallel independence coupled with a courtesy agreement that, if honored, would serve both parties reasonably well. He found himself, unexpectedly, impressed. The letter arrived on the 14th of October on a private courier boat from Antwerp. Bas found it. It reached the factor's back room that evening. He read it, had Peter produce 3 perfect copies by morning, sent 1 copy to the merchant, who paid without comment and was never seen again, and sent a second, sealed, to a drop point he had established for communication with the woman from the tavern. The 3rd copy he kept. He did not, for a long time, tell anyone on Zwarte Steeg what the letter said. What it contained was a detailed and specific account of a scheme involving 3 senior officials of the Dutch East India Company and a Spanish intermediary that, if true, represented the most significant case of corporate espionage in the company's history. It named names, specified dates, described the mechanism by which proprietary Dutch trading routes and company intelligence had been systematically passed to Spanish interests for a period of 4 years. If the letter's contents became public, the consequences for Dutch commerce, and for the 3 men named in it, would be catastrophic. The factor understood, sitting in his windowless back room with the lamp burning low, that the letter was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one that was going to be considerably more complicated than anything Zwarte Steeg had handled before. Within 2 weeks of the Spanish letter's arrival, 3 separate parties, none of them the merchant, none of them the woman from the tavern, had sent representatives to Zwarte Steeg seeking to commission work related to its contents. The factor turned all 3 away. This had never happened before. Turning away a client was, in the commercial logic of the street, an act of voluntary poverty. But the factor had read the letter carefully and had understood something that his would-be clients apparently had not. Some information was too powerful to broker. Some information, if you held it, held you back. And a street that dealt in information of that magnitude was no longer an invisible service provider. It was a target. The weeks that followed were the most careful of the factor's career on Zwarte Steeg. He understood, with the clarity that came from 23 years of operating in Amsterdam's underworld, that the letter had changed the street's situation in a fundamental way. Not because of what it said, but because of the fact that multiple parties now knew, or suspected, that a copy of it was in the street's possession. Knowledge of that kind made Zwarte Steeg visible in exactly the way it had spent 20 years avoiding. He began by taking stock of what he had and what it was worth. The letter was worth, in raw commercial terms, an extraordinary amount. The three men it named would pay almost any price to ensure its contents never reached official ears. And there were parties on the other side of the equation who would pay nearly as much to ensure that it did. But the factor had not built what he had built by maximizing short-term profit. He had built it by surviving. He accomplished this in a way that was characteristic of his method, not through secrecy, but through controlled disclosure. Over the course of 10 days in late October, he arranged for the letter's contents, not the original, not a copy, but the essential substance of what it described, to reach 3 specific people in Amsterdam. One was a senior advocate known for his discretion and his genuine commitment to the Republic's commercial interests, who could be trusted to investigate quietly and officially without making his source of information public. One was a member of the company's internal oversight committee who had long suspected something of the kind, but lacked evidence. And one was a journalist whose professional ethics were impeccable and whose reach, in the event of official suppression, extended well beyond Amsterdam's borders. None of these people knew the others had been informed. None of them knew the information had come from Zwarte Steeg, and the net effect of informing all 3 simultaneously was to make the letter's contents, in practical terms, unstoppable. If any one of the 3 pursued it, the others would independently corroborate and amplify, which meant that the men named in the letter had no single point of suppression to target, which meant that targeting Zwarte Steeg as a way of containing the information was pointless, because the information was already loose. The investigation into the Spanish letter's allegations took almost 2 years to complete. 2 of the 3 named officials were ultimately stripped of their positions within the company and fined, though neither was criminally prosecuted. The company's leadership preferred a quiet resolution to a public scandal. The third died of a sudden illness before the investigation concluded, in circumstances that were noted by a few people and commented on by none. The woman from the tavern was never identified. The merchant was never traced. The factor continued to operate on Zwarte Steeg for another 11 years, retiring in 1661 to a property outside the city that was registered in the name of a man who had been dead for 7 years. Anneke van der Burg operated for another 14 years before disappearing from all records in 1664, in circumstances that her colleagues took care never to discuss. The crisis passed. The street returned to its ordinary, extraordinary routines. Commissions came in, were evaluated, assigned, executed, paid for. Information moved in its careful, invisible channels. Problems disappeared. Documents changed. The city above, the Amsterdam of the Golden Age, of the great canal houses and the world-spanning merchant empire, continued its magnificent, profitable life, entirely unaware of the infrastructure below it that made so much of its magnificence possible. Because that was, finally, what Zwarte Steeg was. Infrastructure. Not glamour, not adventure, not the stuff of stories told in taverns. Infrastructure. The piping that carried the water that nobody thought about as long as it kept flowing. The city needed it. The city paid for it. The city preferred not to know it existed. And the people of the street, the Anneke van der Burgs and the Pieters and the factors, the information brokers and the fixers and the specialists whose skills were not listed in any guild register, understood this with a clarity that was, in its own way, a form of dignity. They were not criminals in the sense that the word implied disorder or violence. They were service providers in a market that official society had created through its own necessary hypocrisies, serving clients who were, more often than not, pillars of that same official society. They charged what the market bore, delivered what they promised, and kept absolutely silent about all of it. They were, in the deepest sense of the word, professionals. And they were professionals in one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated, most complex commercial cities in the history of the world. A city that ran on money and information and the movement of goods across half the globe, and that needed, in its dark places, exactly the kinds of people who had gathered on 4 meters of cobblestone in Amsterdam's oldest quarter and made themselves indispensable. The body they found in the Prinsengracht Canal in the winter of 1650 was never conclusively identified. The investigation that should have followed it was closed within a week, after a senior magistrate personally reviewed the file and determined that the matter did not warrant further inquiry. What changed his mind, nobody who knew ever said. But the magistrate was known, in subsequent years, to avoid certain streets in the older parts of the city. He never explained why. He never needed to. Zwarte Steeg was still there. Its people were still working. And some things, in Amsterdam as everywhere, were simply better left as they were.